Shalom everyone, welcome back again to another episode of the Haftarah series of Hebrew and Israel. I'm your host, yeqavvehlə, and this week we are in the Haftarah Parashat Balaq, a very interesting parasha and overall that deals with a story that's completely outside of Israel. Israel becomes a side story, and really the story itself focuses on a completely different group, a completely different nation, and tells us what happened there. And that's a very, very interesting thing, because the majority of the Torah deals with Israel, deals with the fathers of Israel, and not really with everything around them. So this is a very interesting switch. But the switch itself is very relevant because it gives us also an indication about being a sovereign nation and dealing with other nations with the focus on God being the actual protector of Israel. That nations can scheme behind the back of Israel, can come up with different ideas of what they're going to do, and attack Israel from different directions, and yet still fail with these complex plans, and even using God Himself to try to destroy Israel and failing miserably in such an act. And the warning that we get from all of this, and the warning that we get also from the story at the end, is it doesn't depend on the power of enemies, it doesn't depend on how strong some nations are, but it actually depends more on how we behave as a nation. Are we loyal to the God of Israel, or are we not loyal to the God of Israel? You can have military force, you can have a lot of power, you can have a lot of things happening, you can have all the protection you want, all the structure, all the financial structure that you want, all the money in the world, all the power in the world and everything, but it doesn't depend on that. And that is one of the messages that we actually have with the story of Balak, because Balak offers Bilam lots of money, and Bilam says, I can't do it. He says to him, I'll give you whatever you want. He says, I can't do it. Eventually, when God says to him, okay, I'm going to allow you to go, but what I tell you, you will say, he goes ahead and he walks ahead saying, okay, I'm going to destroy Israel now, and it all gets flipped on its back in several opportunities. And Bilam goes ahead and says to Balak, build these altars and do this and do that. And those who listen to the original recordings I did for the Torah portion, it's like pressing different buttons and expecting things to happen. And it doesn't work that way, because the way it's supposed to work is loyalty to the God of Israel and doing His will. And that's really the message of the prophet in what we're going to be reading today, which starts in Micah 5, verse 6, and goes all the way into 6, verse 8. And it's very interesting, some of the elements that we have here. It hints to the story of Balak and Bilam in a few places, and then eventually blatantly speaks about it, because there's a message here of not with force, not with horses, not with tanks, not with all the power in the world do you actually have protection and safety. It's through loyalty to the God of Israel. And this is the message that's given to us by the parasha and by the prophet here. And there's actually an interesting correlation between Micah and the prophet Yeshayahu, because they're both prophesying at the more or less the same time. The background of this period is Assyria does several campaigns against the Levant. There were several attacks by different kings. The first attacks go way back into the second millennium BC, into the Bronze Age and very early Iron Age. But we're talking about a period where the Neo-Assyrian Empire by Tiglath-Pileser III, or Tiglath-Pileser III, he starts expanding again, and then other kings show up. And there were several campaigns at this time that attacked the Aramean nations in the north, attacked the northern kingdom, also even attacked Judea, though Judea was really a very, very small kingdom in the eyes of the Assyrians, so they don't really write a lot about Judea until they really come into conflict with Judea. But this is a period where the northern kingdom has all this army and all these soldiers, and there's a very famous inscription from Kuru, which describes a massive army of 12 kings that go together, and they battle against the Assyrians. And one of the very interesting things is the northern kingdom is actually described as having tens of thousands of chariots. And if I remember correctly, the number is something like 10,000 chariots and 20,000 foot soldiers, or something like that, something in that area. and it's a massive number. And there's this whole discussion: how can they have such a large number of soldiers and such a large army of chariots? Because if we look at the cities of the northern kingdom, Megiddo and Israel and so on, we find places where there were horses, and there's no doubt that they had chariots, but the numbers are very, very big. So usually they argue that this either is a mistake, and it's supposed to be dropped down from 20,000 to maybe 2,000, and basically dropping all the numbers really, really low, and you end up with a much smaller army. But the thing is that if you think about Israel working together with Judea and Edom and maybe some other nations which were their subordinates, you actually can come up with a very, very large army. But it is possible also that the Assyrians exaggerated some of the numbers. But why would they exaggerate such a kingdom or two kingdoms which were really, really small in their eyes? In their opinion, this was the backwaters of everything. I mean, the attitude in the ancient world towards this region was that this is not a place we want to be. I mean, the Egyptians only wanted to control the land of Israel because of the bridge to the other areas. The northern people, Assyrians, Babylonians, Syrians eventually, the Ottoman Empire, their only interest in this area was because it was a bridge. No one really wanted to live here. If you were sent here, you were actually punished. And this was a theme that carried on all the way into the 1920s. Only in the 1920s is suddenly an interest in this land because of for political reasons. But in any case, the main point here is this is a period of war. This is a period where people have developed their armies, and they have their chariots, and they have their foot soldiers and everything, and they're standing and they're saying, we're going to protect ourselves. And the prophet says, well, not really. It doesn't work like that, because for you to prosper and be this strong, you also have to do other things as well. So he uses a very interesting way of describing Israel, and he says, V'haya she'erit Yaakov, this is chapter 5, verse 6, V'haya she'erit Yaakov bekerev amim rabim, and the remains of Israel will be amongst many nations. Now, it's not clear if this is a diaspora or it's just, Israel standing by itself and the nations surrounding it. Ketal me'et Adonai kirvivim alei esev, like the dew from the Lord, like the rains upon the grass. So basically many of them, because dew and rain is scattered everywhere in a large space, but there's millions of drops. Asher lo yeqavvehlə ish, which will not hope to any man, velo yeyachel livnei adam, will not, again, another word for hope, kavan yachal, and it will not too sure exactly what would be a better word to this in English, but it also means to hope for human beings. It basically is pointing out the idea that you are not dependent on anyone except for the God of Israel. Vaya she'erit Yaakov, and he uses a lot of parallels here. So verse 7 is basically a repeat of verse 6. And the remainder of Jacob, which is, again, repeating the same words, Bagoim bekerev amim rabim, in the nations, in the midst of many peoples, Kariyeh bevahamot yar, like the lion amongst the animals of the field, or the animals of the forest, Kichfir be'edrei tzon, like a cub in the herd of the sheep, Asher im avar veramas vetaraf ve'en matzil, who will pass through, will crush and devour, no one can save, no one can stop them. So there's a bit of a debate. Is this really an issue of violence? Would Israel control with violence? Or is it more about to be afraid of, to fear? Because you have to think about it, that this is a relatively violent description, but who says that everything has to be done through violence? So we might be talking about the issue of contrasting Israel to Assyria, where the Assyrians march in and they're walking in with their armies, and the Assyrians use scare tactics to a level that would put certain nations to shame, because they used to crucify people or stake them, leave their skulls and their bodies hanging around in different places, and everyone heard about what they were doing. It wasn't the Romans that invented crucifixion. It was actually the Assyrians who would crucify people to scare everyone around them. So it's not. It might be that there's violence here, and it might be an issue of that Israel has the potential to use violence, but would not necessarily use it as long as it's not needed. So there's a bit of a debate amongst the commentators exactly how to read this. Though if you read it straightforward, it's about being violent. So it's interesting because we always talk about being peaceful and not doing harm and everyone being peaceful and so on. But on the other hand, if you need to use violence, then there's nothing you can do about it. There's a very pacifistic attitude that I see amongst a lot of Jews, and I say, listen, I'm personally against war as well. I don't wish for anyone to die. I don't want war. War is always a bad thing. The only people benefit from war are maybe the manufacturers of weapons. But at the end of the day, if someone attacks you, you have to put your foot down and stop them. And maybe this is the type of attitude that we're talking about here. And it says, "Tarom yadecha al tzarecha." Now this is interesting. This is now direct speech in what we call a volitional mood. Tarom yadecha al tzarecha. May your hand be uplifted, will be greater than the hand of your enemies. V'chol oyevecha ikareto. No, your enemies will be cut off. Why is it using this in this language? So first of all, we can say one of two things. The first one is, this is a prayer. He's praying. May Israel have a strong arm to defeat all its enemies. But it's quite possible here as well that this is already hinting to another element of direct speech, not towards Israel, but already transitioning to the next stage here of discussing the fact that this is not by the power of Israel, but actually the power of God. That the idea of hinting here to the idea of the hand, and all your enemies will be cut off, because anyone who's the enemy of Israel is really the enemy of God, and anyone who's the enemy of God is the enemy of Israel, and kind of playing on a double side here of saying, really, it's the enemies of God. It's really the hand of God that's uplifted against all the enemies. So, and it really does transition very well into verse 9, because it says, Vayav vayom hahu, and it will be on that day, Ne'um Adonai, the word of God. Ne'um really means a speech, the declaration of God, the declaration of the Lord. And by the way, I know that some people have difficulty with the fact that I use the word Lord, and it's because it's in English, but it's very important to point out that I've seen people argue that Lord has to do with the word Baal. In truth, you can play this game with a lot of other words as well, because even the word Adon, Adonai, Adoni, all these types of words relate to the principle of Baal. I mean, it can relate to the principle of what the term Baal means. And it's very important to say that the name Baal is not really a proper name. It's a name which means master or lord. And I would say that with the demise of the worship of Baal, I think that the name Adonai became much more comfortable for a lot of people. But it's very important to point out that Lord is an actual, almost a direct translation of the word Adonai, and we do find the name Adonai used in the Bible as a reference to the God of Israel, because it's referring to the idea of God being our master and Lord. However, notice that the text avoids using the term Baal to refer to the God of Israel, even though it's really a word that indicates the principle of lordship and master. So there's always this dynamic of trying to express people's feelings towards God and referring to God under different terms, but then avoiding some terms because of how it's used amongst other nations. So it's a very interesting dynamic. But when people start saying, "Oh, Lord really equals Baal," what they're saying is the name Adonai equals Baal, and that's very, very problematic to argue, especially with the fact that it actually is used. And when people argue that, oh, someone changed the name and everything, that's a rumor that exists because of the fact that there's a thing known as the Elohim Psalms, and the Elohim Psalms are a group of Psalms which there's duplicates of Psalms in the book of Psalms, and you actually see where sometimes it appears as the name of God, Yud Hey Vav Hey, it's replaced by Elohim. But that's something that the duplicate is actually a development during the Second Temple, where people avoided using the name. You can read researches by Sarah Yefet, Dr. Sarah Yefet, who wrote a lot about this. She has loads of articles about the period of the beginning of the Second Temple, and it seems to be that people were very worried about using the actual name of God. So not using the name of God is actually a much, much, much earlier practice, way before rabbis or anything like that. But just throwing that in because I remembered some comments that I've seen by some people lately. Not necessarily on the recordings, but because I'm pre-recording these recordings, so some things don't even have comments on them yet. But it has been asked before. So now verse 7 really transitions into verse 8 really transitions very well to verse 9, because it says Vayav vayom mahu ne'um Adonai, and it will be in that day. This is in the future. the word of the Lord. V'chrati susecha mikirbecha, will cut off your horses from your midst. Ve'vatim al kevotecha, and I will destroy your chariots. This is actually very similar to what Isaiah 2 verses 6 to 8 says. It says v'timaleh al tzosusim ve'nkatzel merkadavot. It's kind of the opposite, a reversal of what Isaiah describes, because remember, Isaiah is living in a period where King Ahaz was developing his army. His son was trying to stand against the Assyrians, and Isaiah is all about being faithful to God and trusting in God. And Micah is echoing the same idea, but saying the reversal. If Micah is saying, I will destroy your horses, I will destroy your chariots, and it says in verse 10, V'chrati arei artzecha, and I will cut off the cities of your land, V'erasti kol mivtzarecha, and I will destroy all your fortresses. And then he says in verse 11, "V'chrati cheshafim miyadecha," will cut off the sorcery from your hands. U'me'onenim lo yulach, and me'onenim means really. A lot of people relate to the word anan, which means a cloud. People look at the clouds and try to figure out the future. Apparently, the term has been discovered as being parallel to an Ugaritic term, which actually has to do, Ugaritic in Arabic as well, which means to appear, to come to light. Basically, a me'onen is not a person look at the clouds. It's actually a person who is a soothsayer. He reveals the truth of things. He brings things into light. For many, many years, there have been discussions about what does it mean, what does it mean, what does it mean, and and most commentators and most people you speak with say, oh, it has to do with looking at the clouds. But apparently, the term actually appears in other places, and when a term like this appears and it has a statement next to it in some other language, it clarifies some words. So it's really important to understand that sometimes understanding a meaning of a word would not necessarily come from a root, because the root might be connected to a foreign language. It might be a loan word and things like that. Which means that we have to find the context of that word in other languages. So in many places you hear people say, oh, is it looking with clouds? It's apparently not the case. So those who bring to light, basically soothsayers, will not be to you anymore. And then he says, he continues on and says, V'chrati fesilecha, will cut off your statues, umatzevotecha, and your pillars or your stones. Basically, these are large stones that they would erect, and sometimes they'll have writings on them. You see, if you go, for example, to the Israel Museum, you'll see these stones with different carvings on them, a sun disk, hands raised up, statues of actual gods. Is even a very famous one. We spoke about the Ugaritic Phoenician god, the Syrian god, known as Baal. His parallel, by the way, is Hadad. These are all thunder gods. What's very interesting, by the way, is that years ago, I remember I read a book about world religions, and what was very interesting is that a lot of cultures had very similar gods. The Egyptians didn't, but when you go up to the area of basically Syria, Anatolia, basically Western Turkey of today, and you go into Greece, and then the Romans, and then you go up into the Nordic lands. They all have like this thunder god who's this big famous, most important god, but he always has a father character over him, but the father character is always like behind the background. His son rises to be the king of the gods and everything, and it's very interesting. So it looks like very clear these were influences upon influences upon influences, going all the way into the famous Nordic gods that there's a whole bunch of movie franchises connected to it, even though it's connected and disconnected from the original stories. And it raises some questions about is it even appropriate to watch these movies? But some people can argue it's inappropriate. Some people might argue it is okay because it's not really the Nordic legends. I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, you can argue it's just entertainment. On the other hand, you can argue that this is cultural influence. But what the prophet is actually describing here is cultural influence, and it's a very, very important thing that I really want to discuss here in a moment. And it says, "But I will take away the pillars. I will take away all the headstones from your midst. And you will not bow down to the deeds of your hands." Now, the prophet Isaiah says very similar things, but he talks about the opposite. So he says in his chapter 2, verses 6 to 7, his land was filled with horses, and there is no end to his chariots. Verse 7, for they are filled like the Easterners. They're filled more from the East. And this is basically a superlative comparative clause, for they are filled more than the East, which probably means more chariots, because you have to understand that charioteers were very, very famous in the East. The Egyptians and the Assyrians had a lot of chariots, and this was part of their forces. But it can also be that they're filled more than the East, more than the idol worshipping of the East. And the soothsayers of the Philistines. And his land was filled with idols. This again going back to verse 6. This is structured. I'm using here a structure that someone created to show this, but they're saying the same thing. So you go back to verse 6, and his land was filled with idols. The term Elilim is a very interesting thing, because the term Elil also relates to the word Elul, and Elul is a lie. So this is not Elim as gods, as the way it should be. It's Elilim, because it has to do with the idea of also hinting, mocking it, saying these are lies. To the deeds of his hands you bow down, which his fingers have made. There's a very, very strong parallel here. Now, there's an interesting question about cultural influence. And first of all, one very important thing to point out is that there's actually no real evidence that the Assyrians forced their culture on everyone else. So anything that they would worship would be voluntary. But the other side of it as well is that we don't really find the worship of Assyrian gods. We don't find monuments to Ashul or any declarations toward Ashul, which is the Assyrian god. This is why Assyria is called Assyria. It's often the name of the city Ashul, and Ashul was the main god there. And he actually, if I'm not mistaken, the Ashul was placed over the original god there, which was Marduk. There's a whole story there of I think it was Sancheriv or something like that. I can't remember exactly right now. One of their kings switched the positions of the gods and exalted one god over the other, which is very, very peculiar for us, we come from faiths or religions where there's really only one god. And if there's more than one god, there's usually a hierarchy, and suddenly this human being shows up and says, oh no, the most important god is Ashul. And he actually changed the stories, where the Enuma Elish, the creation story, it's no longer the original god Marduk, now it's Ashul. He changed the literature and everything, went in and just rewrote everything for his own needs. But there's actually no real evidence that the Assyrians forced their religions on anyone. It was only out of will, and really in the beginning it was mostly just cultural, just adopting their culture. Now I actually wrote something not long ago on my personal Facebook, and this is, by the way, a moment just to say to ask, don't send me friend requests on my personal Facebook. I would not accept them. I apologize for this, but my personal Facebook is for me and my friends, and I keep on getting requests. People who find my Facebook page, Hebrew in Israel, for those who don't know, Hebrew in Israel is the Facebook page. HebrewInIsrael.net is the website. You can also email me at HebrewInIsrael@gmail.com. And this is also an opportunity to remind everyone that if you are interested in contributing to the programs and everything, I don't know if you can hear that, but that's a jet plane in the background. I'll give it a second. And that's because we actually have, not too far away from where I live, we actually have an Air Force base. And I'm pretty sure you can hear this. The indicator's telling me that you can. And they fly over here all the time. I mean, I grew up in this town, so I'm very used to these noises. So this is an interesting opportunity to have this in the background. And so if the programs really do benefit you, please consider helping by donating. Any sum is perfectly fine. I'm not trying to get rich out of this. It's just supporting the time and the research. And going back to the subject, so really what happened was that what we do see is more of the adoption of Assyrian style, Assyrian clothing, we don't really see a lot of Assyrian burial. There's some Assyrian burial in this area, but that actually might be, like, for example, this thing known as the Assyrian burial bath. The reason they call it a bath is it looks like a tub. It looks like a bathtub, and they used to bury people in this. So we don't really see a lot of that influence, but we do see external influences of culture. Now, this is, by the way, known as cultural imperialism. This is a subject, you can Google it. And the whole idea of cultural imperialism is the idea that a much larger influential culture seeps into someone else's culture, either deliberately or not. It really depends. Today, for example, most of the cultural imperialism is not deliberate. It's just people are attracted to it because it opens up different opportunities, especially the principle of the Western culture of freedom. See how long that lasts. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bad stuff going on, and it seeps through, and it actually starts eroding other people's cultures. And the thing is, it's not the issue of Pokemon cards, like someone said to me, or it's not the issue of do you watch this action movie or do you drink Coca-Cola. It's really not that. Is there something wrong with Pokemon cards? Probably not. If there's something wrong with Harry Potter, that's already a different discussion because of the issues of witchcraft in the movie franchise, and the books as well. But on the other hand, it's more about fantasy. It's unreal. But then when you listen to some of the words used there, it's actually words. Some of the words are actually from. Some of the magic spells are actually real words which are used in Aramaic and so on. So there's a big question there. But the problem is that basically, if you open up too much to certain elements of culture, not everything. Coca-Cola is not the problem. Video games are not the problem. It's not Pokemon cards or cartoons or something like that. It's the problem how certain messages are sent through. A lot of television programs now promote ideals which are anti-religious or are against the Torah or against God, and some of them are really, really bad. I mean, there've been movies that I sat down to watch, and I don't have a problem watching a movie. I'm not gonna. I don't really watch that much television. I have other things to do, but when you want to relax and you want to watch television, you have to be very careful what you watch, because there have been programs that I actually stopped in the middle and said, I don't want to watch this because this is so against my what I hold up as being the way we should live our lives. But the problem is that if you allow your kids to watch stuff like this, if you allow yourself to be overexposed to such principles with no monitoring of what you're doing, it slowly does sip into your mind. There's actually been studies going back into 1984. I saw one of the very early books about this, because only the 1970s, 1980s, more and more houses got television, so more and more people were exposed to it. The influence of viewing a video and the messages going into your head actually influences the way we're structured, and there have been people saying we're being programmed by television. Now, I don't believe in conspiracy theories, but I think that the idea of sending propaganda through sometimes innocent things such as television, and basically ruining, in many cases, most people's fun, because we don't want a political message here or something to do with someone's whatever it might be, identity politics or something like that. We need to understand it does influence it. And when you look at, and this stuff goes way, way back into antiquity. So we see the Assyrians showing up, the Israelites were adopting their culture, and boom, the culture was in, and it destroyed them. And that's the same thing that happened with Bilam and Balak. They brought in something that they brought in the Moabite women, something that, obviously had a sexual element to it. They seduced them, and they ended up probably worshiping their idols. If you remember correctly, they did. And the Midrash expands upon this even more. So we need to be very, very careful with the cultural influences that we have. Now, again, I live in Israel. My culture is a little different than, say, someone in Europe or somewhere in America. I have students, when I teach Hebrew, I have students who are from Europe, and I have students who are from America, and I have students from South Africa, and I've had students from Australia, and I've had students who live in Asia and everything. You can see the different cultures. and how they react to each end and everything. But we're all wearing the same clothing. We're all using very similar principles. I mean, we sometimes use certain pop culture references, and we all understand what it means. But what makes the difference between one person and the other, and why one culture can survive another culture doesn't, because it depends how much you're rooted in your culture and how much you're not willing to let go and how much you're not willing to give up on your culture, and say to yourself, listen, we're willing to have this up to a certain point, but we're not going to let this take over. And the problem was what happened in the desert and what happened with the northern kingdom and even the southern kingdom, Israel and Judah, was they didn't stop it. They didn't put the limit. They didn't say, okay, oh, this is wonderful technology, let's use that. But they also have all these other things that they're doing. Let's go there as well. It's all shiny and sparkly and everything, and that's where they basically lost. This is where you lose the battle. So some people shut themselves away. For example, the ultra-Orthodox world shuts itself away from Western culture, even though still, they drive cars and everything, but they pick the things which are necessary. But you can argue that the clothing that they wear is Western and so on, but that's a complete different discussion. But they, for example, shut themselves away. Some people say we're not going to shut ourselves completely away, like I do, for example. We're going to take what's necessary. We're going to use the computers. We're going to learn how to be more intellectual, more understanding, and become smarter and better. And then there are people just, no barriers whatsoever. There's no rules. You do whatever you want, and then you get swallowed up. And that's unfortunately one of the things that's happened with the ultra-secularism here in Israel, where there are people there's no barriers whatsoever. And in truth, I have no language with these people. I understand what they're doing because I study this culture, because I'm understanding, as an historian, you try to learn what's going on in the culture surrounding you, and you try to understand how things are, how the spirit of the time, the Zeitgeist of the time, messing up that word, sorry, how it's really influencing everything and learning the process mankind is going through. So I understand their culture, but they know nothing about my culture. They know nothing about their ancestors, and that's bad. That's a very, very negative thing. Okay, so going back to the text in verse 14, it says, "Ve'asiti be'afu v'chema nakam et hagoyim," and I will do with wrath and anger, vengeance against the nations, asher lo shamel, which should not listen. Now there's a debate here regarding this verse, because why suddenly are we talking about the nations? How do the nations fit into this? And some people say, well, one possibility is that the nations here is those Israelites who stopped being Israelites by not obeying the God of Israel. That's one opinion that I have seen. Another opinion that I have seen here is that, it says earlier, Israel will be amongst the nations. So it's saying, I'm going to take away, all the, it might be that he's going to take away all the power that the nations have, all the chariots and everything. But because, and he's going to defeat the nations. So verse 14 is like a summary of all of this, but it doesn't fit into the text of it doesn't really fit the parallel to what we have in Isaiah. It doesn't really fit the criticism against Israel and Judah, and therefore it's quite possible that the term goyim here might be more an idea of, I'm going to take away all this power, but I'm also going to take away the power of the nations to show you that I am the one in control. God is the one who is ruling all of this, and not really allowing them to defeat Israel, because God is the one in control. Now we actually go into the historical account, the historical perspective that Micah brings in. This is in chapter 6, verses 1 to 8, and verses 1 to 8 is the second half of the Haftarah. And what we actually have here is a principle known as the Riv. The Riv is actually a legal term that refers to the idea of the court argument between two people or more. Now, the term riv literally comes from the principle of a fight, of a physical argument, an argument, say, in the middle of the market. We're not talking about Western culture. You have to understand that never read anything in the ancient world in the eyes of what you have today. I remember that one of the first things I learned when I did my degree in history was one of my professors turned around to us and said, "Never ever in your right mind." And I really appreciate this. This was like a 5-10 minute thing that my professor gave us before we even started. And she said to us, never read anything in the past in the eyes of the context of our times. Because what they did back then, what we do today, can be completely different. Assuming that a different time or a different culture, even a culture of today, is similar to your culture and has undergone the same pressures and changes that your culture has gone through and you personally have gone through, is a critical and deadly mistake that can lead to judgments and mistakes in understanding what you're looking at and what you're reading. And I go around, when I talk with secular people about the Bible, it's very clear that they don't really understand the Bible because they don't understand the reference. So for example, one says, "Oh, the Bible's a book that promotes violence." I said, no, it's actually not. It actually criticizes the principle of violence, because it's what it's trying to tell you is violence is bad, violence is negative. And violence is only needed when it's necessary. It's not the ideal of what we want here. This is why basically you can read the book of Genesis, from Genesis all the way into Kings, as this is not how you do things. There are glimpses of how you're supposed to do things, but the end result, expulsion for the God and expulsion from the land of Israel, this is how not to do things. Don't do violence. Don't steal from one another. Don't commit adultery. It's showing us throughout history. It's giving us what we refer as historical evidence that if you do this, this is going to happen. And I actually wrote an article a while back about the term emunah. What is emunah? Everyone translates it as faith, but really it's about deeds. It's about doing things, not just believing. It's about doing things. And the term emunah has to do with the word amen, that something is there, something is standing, something is truthful, and really things, there's a saying, words are cheap, and that's actually very, very true. You can use rhetoric until you're blue in the face. I mean, in truth, the use of rhetoric was something that the Greeks invented, and you had the demagogues after several wars that the Greeks had with the Persians and then with themselves, between Athens and Sparta and the Athenian empire, the ocean empire they built up and everything. One of the things that they lost was the office of the strategos, the strategic leader, which basically was a military leader that really at one point replaced the basileus, the king. By the way, basileus comes from the word basil, the leaf, the herb that we use. Is actually, it was known as the king's herb. And eventually what happened was people who talk, and sometimes talk too much, took over the Athenian Empire and actually eroded the Athenian Empire. So kings are expected to do. And when you have faith, it has to do with being something very, very founded. And unfortunately, I've gone completely off the trail what I wanted to say. So I'm just going to go back to the subject of the Riv. So the Riv is a legal discussion. Starts off with an actual physical fight, and it slowly developed into a much more refined principle of, if you have an argument in the market and it turns into a fist fight, you go to the court. But then when people became more and more subtle with themselves and more composed, it turned the term riv, which was the old fight in the market, turned into the argument of legal argument in front of the court and the judges. So the prophet here is talking about bringing forward an argument, a dispute between God and Israel. But he also uses actual physical practical evidence, and now remember what my point was, actual practical evidence of, remember what happened in the past, remember the historical occurrences that happened that prove my loyalty to you. Okay, so it says, Shim'una, verse 1 of chapter 6, Shim'una et asher amar, asher Adonai omer. Hear, please, or hear, and using the term na could mean please. Here it's more about, not please, it's saying listen, take heed. that which the Lord is saying. Kum riveterim, arise and make the legal argument with the mountains. But it's not with the mountains, it's using the mountains as witnesses. So this is a very unusual way of using the word et. It doesn't translate as with, it's using the mountains and also the hills as two witnesses that are the direct object of the claim of the speech, because riv is usually should be with the word with the word im, which means it's a reciprocal verb. It means that they struggle with one another, but he's not trying to say that. And this is why using the term im, the preposition im would be incorrect. This is why he uses the term et, to probably use the term et to avoid that obscurity. And he's saying, argue with the presence of the mountains. V'tishman hagevaot kolech, and the hills will hear your voice. Shim'u harim et riv Adonai, hear the mountains, and then it becomes very clear. Hear the mountains, the argument of the Lord. V'ha'etanim mosedei aretz. Okay? And the etanim, which etan really means something which is stronghold, founded. So the strong ones were founded in the earth. Basically, a mountain sits on the earth, a hill sits on the earth. It's greatly founded. So it's another way of referring to the mountains. If you had any doubt who the fight really is, then he uses the preposition im, with. For the Lord has a dispute with his nation. And with Israel he will argue. And he points out what is the argument. Ami, my people. This is now a rhetoric. This is now a speech. So kings do, prophets speak. And then prophets sometimes also do symbolic acts to point out what they intend, what the symbolism, what they're saying as well. My people, me asiti lecha, what have I done to you, and what have I done to make you tired? This is because these are parallels and you're missing parts. You have to move words from one place to the other. For those who can really follow the Hebrew, this is a parallel where you have to move words from one column to the other, or from one clause to the other. So what have I done to you, and what have I made you tired? Anevi, answer to me. What have I done to you that's brought you to this point? Because this type of what have I made you tired of? Exhausted you with something. I've made you feeling miserable, made you feel tired because of it. Answer me. And he says, and he says, obviously the answer is there isn't anything. And he goes ahead and he says, for I brought you up from the land of Egypt, from the house of servitude I have redeemed you. And I sent before you Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. It's very interesting he points out Miriam here, because Moshe and Aaron were really the ones who did most of the actions. But Miriam seems to be even hinted in some places in the book of Exodus, and even the book of Numbers, when Miriam passes away. We see that she is very prominent in the community. She's very prominent. She has a position. She has a place there. It's just not emphasized, because really it's about Moses and about Aaron, about Aharon doing all these different deeds. And he says, so I took you out of Egypt. And then he says, Zechor, Ami Zechorna, Maya'atz Balak Melech Moab. My people, please remember what Balak, king of Moab, plotted. Uma'ana oto Bil'am ben Beor, and what Bil'am, son of Beor, answered him. Ana here is to respond to the request, but it's also refers to the idea of la'anot in the sense of speaking the prophecy. It's not just that Bil'am says, oh, come over and do this to Israel, and he says, no, I can't. It's also referring to the prophecies themselves, that where Bilam says to him, you really want to know what's going to happen here? The whole prophecy that we have at the end there, Israel will rise up, and their star will shoot from Jacob, and will crush all the enemies and everything. Again, going back to the question of, is this really violence, or is this just a response to someone else's violence? Okay? It says, as min ha-shittim ad Gilgal, from Shittim all the way to Gilgal. So this is really the kind of like the area that we're in. It's not really clear why he specifically refers to Shittim and Gilgal here, because they weren't sitting in Shittim until they really at the end of the book of Numbers, and they don't really go into Gilgal because Gilgal is in the land. Maybe it has to do with what he was able to see from the places he was standing at. but I am not really clear how the Shittim and the Gilgal step in here. But you do have maybe a reference here that the sin of Baal Pe'o, which is really part of, which appears after this, is being referenced here. Maybe that's the whole idea. But if we think about it, that if the Israelites were very close to Shittim or eventually ended up at Shittim, because we're not really hearing much about the movement of Israel, what they were doing at the time. They might have been that they were moving through, and they weren't really encamping, or they were encamping for a short period of time. And we also don't know how long of a time passed from the story of Bilam all the way to the story of the Midianite women, or the daughters of Moab. So it's possible that from that point on there was still maybe a couple more days, or a couple more, or maybe a week or so, and they traveled and they reached Shittim at the end. So we don't really get a clear chronological point of where they're actually sitting. And this is why Shittim to Gilgal, it might be that he was able to see that from the places he was standing at. Okay? And he says, so what did Bilam son of Beor answer him from the Shittim to Gilgal? Leman da'at tzidkot Adonai, for the purpose of knowing the righteousness of the Lord, the righteous deeds of the Lord, to point out that God was there to always protect them. This is the whole idea of the emunah, of the ne'emanut, of the loyalty, by doing these righteous deeds. Because when you make a promise, you have to stand behind your words, take responsibility for what you promise. So now he's going, so God did all this righteousness. So what is he expecting from you? So he says, he puts a rhetorical question in the mouth of the people. Not rhetorical, a theoretical question. But this might be something that people turn around to the prophet and says, okay, you're saying all this, so what do I do? Because what we know is ritual. We know that you go to the temple, if you do these sacrifices and everything, the prophet says it's only part of the Torah. There are more parts. You're obsessed with the ritual. You've become like Bilam. You think that you're going to put these altars up and press these buttons, and presto, you're going to have what you need. You think that it's witchcraft. You think that you can throw in whatever you want with these rituals and suddenly get away with everything that you're doing. So he said, they asked the question, Bema kadem Adonai, what would I greet the Lord? Yeqavvehlə Elohem maroma, bow down to the God of up high. Ha'akadamenu be'olot be'agalim b'nei shana, should I greet him with burnt offerings, with calves 1 year old, very expensive stuff? And he says to them, no, that's not what is expected from your spirit. It's not what he's saying. You're missing the point, because the first stage of being loyal to the God of Israel is to be loyal to the God of Israel. This is not pressing buttons. This is not doing some external ritual that suddenly, oh, presto, I have everything that I want. But there's a very important danger, a very important thing to say about this, because it developed into a very dangerous understanding in different movements. Martin Buber, who was a Jewish philosopher, Bible scholar, very, very old school type of stuff that he did, came out with this book about the morality of the prophets. And he, together with most of the academic world at the time, and even today it's less accepted, but back then it was very prominent, they were trying to separate between the morality of the Torah and the acts of the Torah. They were trying to say, emunah, it's just faith. Everything else was made up much later. So he wanted to push this idea that the prophets he was using something a little different. He was trying to say, no, there is a separation. It wasn't the Torah wasn't there before. It's the prophets emphasized something more about faith. And he ignores the context here, where it's not against faith, it's against the fact that people like Bilam were using the sacrifices as buttons, as if I'm going to punch a code in and everything is going to be perfectly fine. And that's not what it's about. God is not speaking against sacrifices. He's speaking against the lack of morality in the people. That if you're not going to do the proper behavior with one another and do the other parts of the Torah, then there's no point in bringing the sacrifices, because God says, I don't need your sacrifices. You're not doing this for me. I don't need to be fed or anything like that. This is a very, very monotheistic message as well, because in the ancient world, people believed you have to feed the gods. If you make the gods happy, they'll be happy and we'll be blessed. But there's no actual morality here. There's no moral behavior here. Even if when you read, for example, law codes in the ancient Near East, you see that it's more about law and people's rights and property and less about moral behavior. In the Torah and Leviticus and many other places points out, for I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. There's a moral code here. There's a moral principle that you have to follow. It's not just about civil behavior. It's not just about, don't steal because that's harming someone. You're stealing their property. It's also about this is the right thing to do. You have to be a moral person. So the prophet answers to them and says, Hayirtzeh Adonai, this is verse 7, Hayirtzeh Adonai be'alfei elim, where the Lord wants thousands of rams, birvevot nachale shamen, with thousands of rivers of fat, ha'iten bechorei fishin. Then he goes into the absurd. This is the absurd argument. Will I give my firstborn for my sin? Obviously not. Human sacrifice is abhorrent to the Bible. God objects to this behavior. Piri vitni hatat nafshi, the fruit of my stomach, as the guilt offering or the sin offering of my soul, of my spirit. God says, of course not. I don't want this and I don't want that. Obviously, I don't want the human sacrifice. I mean, they're saying, what other extreme can I do here that maybe God will want me? Okay, I'll sacrifice my own kid. No, it's taking this, he's using the absurd argument. The reductio ad absurdum, or the argumentum ad absurdum, the ridiculous argument, and he's going to the extreme, saying, I don't want all these things. You're thinking that if you're going to show up with all these things, oh, okay, great, they brought me my bribe. No, this is not what he wants. And he says in verse 8, and this is how the prophecy, this part of the prophecy ends. Hagid lecha adam matov. I will say to you, man, putting us in proportion. Man, you are just man. All of these things that you're trying to bring before me, I created them. I own them. I am the one who allowed you to use these things. I don't need them. If I want an infinity of rams, I can do that. This is what God is saying. That's not what I want for you. Man, human being, remember your place in the universe. I will tell to you what is good. Uma Adonai doresh mimecha, and what the Lord seeks of you. Kim asot mishpat, for to do justice. Bring balance to the world which I have created. The same way that God said, let there be light. Creating light is a principle of bringing order to the world. Do justice. Ve'ahavat chesed, and to love compassion. Ve'tznei alechet im Elohecha, and to be modest. The word tzana is to reduce, to make less of something. The idea of, for example, there was a period here in Israel known as Tufat Hatzena, back in the 50s and 60s, where people literally lived off of food stamps and everything. You had the Great Depression after the Second World War. You had the Great Depression in the 1920s in the United States, and people basically had to really control what they have. And people talking about thousands of rams and everything is because they had too much. We live in a society where there's too much. We've lost purpose. We've lost morality, many of us, because we're too busy about making money. We're too busy in trying to be instead of being better human beings, we're trying to better our lifestyle. And yes, I mean, if we invent flying cars, that's great. But let's not forget that what keeps us human is the morality. It's to do justice. It's to be good people, not to allow erosion that pretends to be progress. It says, be humble, realize how little we are, because we are man. Hagir lecha adam matov. Remember that we're just human beings. We don't live forever. We don't have eternal power. Only God has eternal power. Only He has eternal kingship over the universe. We just have to remember that if we want to be His servants, all we have to do is be good to one another, to do justice in the world, to do the goodness that keeps the world continuing on, and we're not destroying everything for our next generation. Next generations take responsibility of our deeds, and to really try to comprehend and understand what God really wants from us. I hope you enjoyed this recording. Like always, comments are welcome. This is a learning process. I'm just expressing my ideas and opinions about this. Comments, questions are always welcome. Remember, you can go to hebrewinisrael@gmail.com to send me emails. You can communicate with me on the website hebrewinisrael.net. You can leave a comment. It might take me a little bit of time to get to it, but I will. I always make sure I sit down and look at all the comments. And you can go to the Hebrew in Israel at Facebook, communicate with me, like the page if you've never seen the page. And I want to wish everyone a wonderful Shabbat, and I hope you enjoyed the study. Kol tov.